Welcome, everyone, to the C-Suite Sales and Marketing Perspectives podcast. I'm Steve McDonald, the host. And today we have a very special guest named Christina Kyriazi. And Christina, you are the SVP of Marketing at PhotoShelter. But what we're going to be talking about today is something that you've been training for a long time. You did economics in school, you got an MBA, you started out on the analytics side of marketing. We're going to be talking about the CMO's ROI blind side today and really attaching ROI to marketing and deep penetration into the pipeline that we all know we're supposed to be focused on, but really putting the analytics behind it. And the technology, our ability to do that is constantly changing. So we're very interested in your perspectives today. But maybe before we start, would you mind just expanding on kind of that light touch on your background and what you're doing today? And then we'll dig right in.
Sure, absolutely. It's good to be here. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to chat today. So yeah, as you said, I did start my career off in analytics, and I actually never thought I would end up in a marketing leadership position, but here we are. I think marketing has shifted in the last 10 or 15 years to be a much more analytical function than it used to be. So I was kind of in the right place at the right time, I guess, with the right skill set to rise to the right role. Currently, I lead the marketing department at PhotoShelter, as you said. It's a digital asset management software. So I get to market to marketers, which is a lot of fun.
Understand your ICP, right?
Exactly. Yeah, I totally get it.
Well, if you wouldn't mind, let's start out because bringing up the ICP, customer-focused marketing, understanding your ICP and who they are. We're not always a CMOs actually living and breathing the job of our ICP. So how do you understand your ICP in order to have really truly customer-focused marketing? Like, what do you do?
Yeah, I think honestly, it's one of the most, if not the most important step that marketers and marketing leaders should be taking is really, really honing into the ICP and defining it the right way. And it doesn't just impact marketing, it actually impacts the whole organization. Who marketing focuses on should be the same folks that sales focuses on and product focuses on and so forth. So it's not just defining your ICP right, it's not just a marketing impact, but it has an impact across the organization. So I've actually focused in organizations that have been in high growth periods, B2B SaaS for the most part. And what I've found is that in order to have that inflection point to help that growth, is you really need to start focusing on what is going to make you successful and what's going to make you successful the fastest way possible. That means that a lot of companies have to depart from what they're used to of trying to target everyone and anyone that will buy their product to now focus on the most profitable, the most efficient potential targets and really hyper focus on those and say no to the ones that are not as efficient and profitable for you. So that's where I think customer marketing and customer focused marketing comes into play. I think it's a superpower that CMOs should deploy as much as possible because it can really make you or break you, not just as a marketer, but it can make you or break you as an organization. So the way that I usually do it is I try to take a three-pronged approach. I try to talk to the customers as much as possible. So you'll hear me talking to 30 customers in my first 90 days in a new role, for example. It doesn't have to happen when you're in a new role. It could happen at any point in your tenure with an organization, but constantly talking to customers, understanding, getting direct feedback from them. Number two is analyzing data that you have access to internally, and then analyzing data that you have access to externally. So for example, the internal data may be everything from churn data to historical sales performance by segments to customer segmentation. And then external data may be total addressable market, analysis of a certain market, and what third-party data is available out there. So I always try to take that three-pronged approach to start with and start to understand where I should focus.
So a couple of things I wanted to unpack that you said there. The negative impact on the organization of going after a broader market. We've got as for CEOs and our CROs and the board, they're all very focused on things like quotas, like how are we doing this quarter? How is next quarter showing up? So there's a built-in incentive for inside the organization to expand the audience that we're selling to. But what ends up happening is if you bring in money that feels really good in the short term, but it's not the ICP. So therefore, the company is truly not set up to service them as well as people that are in your ICP. They're going to churn faster. You're going to waste resources internally. Your NRR is going to go down, and you're going to spin your wheels where really that customer focused is the customer that comes and stays and signs up again. That's the ICP. That's who you want to recreate because that's going to be the most efficient way to scale your business. So this idea of customer focused marketing is so important. And the second thing that you talked about is how many CMOs or SVP of marketing come in and actually spend the time to get on the phone and talk to customers. You could have listened to a bunch of gong calls. They're there, right? But those are conversations, and you and I talked about this offline, that like every sales conversation does have a shield up in the middle of it, right? And they know they're being sold to. Where I'm sure you get on, how do you introduce yourself and why you even want to have that conversation? Like, how do you dismantle this where this is a sales conversation where you're just truly trying to learn? How do you even approach that?
Yeah. And just to be transparent, I do it to this day. I actually did some customer outreach last week and I had 2 customer calls. So it's not just something I do in the beginning, but initially when I first started a role, it's very easy. I introduce myself. Hey, you're a customer at my organization that just joined. I'm trying to learn from customers like you. Let's have a 30-minute conversation over the phone, very informal, no expectations of anything. I'm just here to learn. And usually those 30-minute conversations turn into an hour-long conversation. What I found 99% of the time, people are just excited to talk to someone from the organization that they're paying money to for a software, especially. So they welcome that outreach, but it's not like 100% of them are going to respond to my emails. I might send 50 emails and I might get 10 of them to respond, which is fine. Some of them circle around and they come back around. And I always like to, a year later or 6 months later, also circle back to the ones that I did speak to and say, hey, let's have another conversation. And we just form that relationship over time.
So here's a big takeaway. Block off time after that initial half-hour scheduled calendar. Make sure the last thing you do is have a customer that is willing to open up and like enjoying and talking. You're like, I'm so sorry, I've got a prep call. So I think that is a lost art of the conversation and the right conversation, right? Because we want to make sure that we are having conversations. And I've said this with CROs, and they've completely agreed that it's outside of the bounds of sales, right? There's a very different dynamic that just happens there. So learning from existing customers that way is so, so important. Okay, now I want to transition into what is in your mind the CMO's blind side around ROI, financial outcomes from specific marketing activities? Where is that blind side and how are you addressing that?
Yeah, there are several. So I think it truly does start with the efficiency side. So again, really, it can be very easy for you to dive into a new role or even into your current role and be hyper focused on how do I drive this pipeline number? Like, let me get every single avenue possible. And sometimes you just got to step back and be like, okay, what's the most efficient way to do that? Because we're trying to be efficient. We're not trying to waste resources. And a lot of CMOs kind of fall into this trap, I think, of trying to do as much as possible and just kind of jam everything and hope something sticks instead of being very strategic about spending resources, time, and money into the 3 to 5 bets that maybe you want to take. And hopefully a couple of them will work out. So I think that's a big blind side that a lot of CMOs have. Maybe they don't have the time to slow down or they don't think they can slow down to actually figure out what's the most efficient way to actually cut back and do almost less, but do it a lot more efficiently to produce the results that you need to produce.
So what you're saying here is actually don't just accept that list of activities that marketing is asked of every single day, right? I mean, we can be driven by the tactics, but we have to have a way to prioritize. And how do you handle that? How do you say no? Because to be efficient is you've got to be able to say no, but you've got to do it in a way that you're still in service of the different departments. That's an art in of itself.
Yeah, I think a lot of CMOs think of their function as marketing instead of as the organization. I am here to make sure that the organization succeeds. And if that means that marketing budget needs to be cut in order to produce a really hot feature for engineering to get extra resources, like that's what we're going to do because that's what's good for the company. Where incentives get misaligned is when CMOs are like, no, I have to spend this money, or I have to have this budget, I have to have this many headcount. And the rest of the organization suffers maybe because of that, or it doesn't align with the organization's incentives. So what I try to do always is I try to align with first the CFO, who becomes my best friend very quickly, and then the rest of the executive team to make sure that we're all putting our money, which is the collective money of the organization, where we believe as a collective group that is going to work the best. And we're going to hold each other accountable to make sure that it actually happens. So usually what I'll do is I think numbers can actually help you a ton. So I'll align with the CFO and I'll be like, okay, what are our stakeholders trying to achieve? If we're trying to achieve profitability, that means we need to hold expenses at a certain level versus our revenue. If profitability is not at the top, but maybe revenue growth is way higher on the priority list, I know I need to prioritize these other things. So I try to align with the CFO, and really at the end of the day, depending on your investors or whoever stakeholders you have, whatever their incentives are, I try to align them around that. So at the end of the day, you end up with a bucket of potential resources, right? Like,
Right.
I'm just going to make up a number. Christina, you get $1 million to spend. How are you going to spend it? So that really forces you to prioritize, right? And after that, it becomes a relatively easy conversation with the rest of the organization, who ideally it has aligned at the top to say, okay, we as an organization have $1 million to spend on marketing. How are we going to do it? Now we need to do X, Y, and Z. We can't do these other 10 things because we believe these are way more impactful. So we're going to do these things and hope they work so that we can get more resources to then invest into these other things we want to do. So it's a constant sort of calculation of what we can spend versus what we can get. And you have to take, as a CMO, a very non-defensive approach. It needs to be very objective of what's the greater good of the organization? How can I help with that?
I think this is where your economic MBA background really helps, because what you're saying here is you have to be your own outside objective, analyzer of your own performance and what you're doing in order to say, no, sometimes we need to be ruthless. We can't just do this, right? We don't have the resources to do this. It's not the highest priority. Basically, how do you analyze marketing performance? What is your perspective on that?
So I'm a big fan of Salesforce. I'm in Salesforce all the time and kind of watch how things are going. So I like to first have a shared dashboard with my sales team because I think marketing and sales should be aligned around the same exact numbers. So I make sure that we all have the same numbers that we ladder up to, and it's clear who has what and who has what responsibility. And we actually review those dashboards on a weekly, if not more frequent basis. I actually refresh that dashboard obsessively throughout the day. So we have certain metrics. Depending on the organization, you're going to have different metrics. But in my organization currently, we have metrics from the amount of traffic we're trying to drive to our website to how many MQLs we're going to drive. And we've defined what that means, how many SQLs we expect to convert, and then how many SQLs convert to SQOs, which is where it hits pipeline, and then what the close one rate is. We also have certain churn metrics that we're watching to make sure that we're not, as you said earlier, bringing in customers that are going to churn down the road. So we try to take a whole holistic approach to looking at metrics that are good for the whole organization. And the key thing there that we'll emphasize is that it's not marketing's dashboard. It is the organization's dashboard that marketing contributes to, so that marketing doesn't live in a silo and nobody wonders what marketing does. The numbers are clear, you're measured against those numbers, and you can deliver or not deliver, but it's very, very clear to the organization what you're aligned to.
So clearly understand same set of numbers you're working on with marketing and sales. Who is owning what aspect of those numbers? If you both are working off the exact same numbers, then it can be easy to say that was more your responsibility, right?
Yeah.
Same numbers, two different organizations working as one team. How do you co-own?
Yeah, the way I see it is my sales counterpart is going to hyper focus on conversion rate from pipeline to close one. That's their incentive too. That's what they're here to do. So they're going to hyper focus on, are we moving all the deals through the pipeline? Are we making sure that we're not leaving money on the table? Are we getting the best value from each sale that we're making? And we're not wasting time and effort on non-fruitful prospects. Marketing to me should own everything up from that. So the pipeline number, are we bringing in enough for our sales team and enough at bats for our sales team to take to actually achieve the revenue goal that we all want to achieve? Are we bringing up enough meetings, enough leads, enough traffic to our website? So you kind of ladder up all those metrics. And that's what I am hyper focused on. And it's almost like we're a team. Like I'm watching this, you're watching this. We're all watching all the numbers and we hold each other accountable. As soon as a certain aspect of the funnel starts to drift, I have the authority to be like, hey, sales counterpart, this seems iffy. What's going on? Is there feedback? Like, did I send you bad leads or is it something else? And then they also have the authority to be like, hey, marketing, I don't have enough here to make this number. So what's going on? So it's really a partnership and it needs to be that way. But we have clarity on who owns what number and what we're measured up against.
Okay, so that leads to the next tough question, which is we have to own the entire pipeline, right? Like it used to be, I line up the traffic, we get the MQLs, we qualify as SQLs, and we throw it over the wall, and it's your responsibility from there, right? We know that it doesn't work that way. So there are certain numbers that you're owning and responsible for, but how do you support after it gets thrown over the wall? That's some of the biggest, we do a series on this podcast called Why Do BV CMOs Fail So Quickly? And it's that misalignment with marketing and sales, which is one of the biggest driving factors. So how are you partnering beyond the analytics and owning those numbers? How are you partnering through the actual close of the sale itself?
Yeah, I personally pay very close attention to our close one rate, especially. I think that tells you a lot. And I think as a marketer, if you are not paying attention to it, then you're missing half the story. So I can tell you when I first came onto PhotoShelter, I was the CMO that actually reduced pipeline. And that was a scary place to be. But our close one rate was abysmal before. So I questioned the pipeline. Was it real? I don't think it was. So through a lot of focusing on the right segments and where we say no instead of saying yes to everything and pushing it through the pipeline to inflate our pipeline and all of a sudden we look good, you got to start saying no in what you qualify and normalize that pipeline, the conversion rate for close one rate, so that you have a reliable model. So the way I look at it is once it gets to sales, I'm still responsible for it. And I still have some accountability in terms of making that successful in a couple of ways. One is making sure that, again, we have that clarity of who is the most likely to convert. And for me to make sure I have through the BDR team or other avenues, sort of stop gaps to say, okay, don't waste sales' time with a lead that is not going to be fruitful. Don't do it. Qualify extra hard to make sure the sales only takes at bats with the best leads possible. And then number two is I actually have a product marketing function within my organization, and they helped a ton with sales enablement, sales training, continuous kind of feedback loop for sales. So that if sales runs into situations where they're like, oh, we're not sure how to handle this, like objection handling, product marketing can step in and help out, or persona training or ICP training and new collateral production and ROI models and stuff like that. So there's always a function of marketing that I think mostly actually lives within the sales organization rather than pure marketing that I like to have in my group to keep that connection very tight and to keep that accountability there to make sure our conversion rate for close one doesn't plummet.
I'm fascinated to know the conversations when you said, I'm going to shrink our pipeline. So, one thing to hear that, and we're all saying, absolutely, right? We got to make sure that we're not, like we talked about earlier, we're not addressing organizations outside of our ICP that we're not ready to handle, that are just going to churn anyways, it's not going to be efficient and it's going to waste a bunch of internal resources. So, we all get that. There's a lot of organizations going to shrink the pipeline. Here's my question. How do you do that? So we remember things 22 times more if it's told to us in the form of a story. You've just told us what had to happen. Now I want to know, how do you have those conversations? In the same way that you explained at the beginning how you set up the conversation with customers and set it up so that it's a very casual conversation, very productive conversation. How do you set up the conversations with sales and your CFO and your CEO? And then when you go to the next board meeting and they're like, what do you mean the pipeline is shrunk? How do you do that? How do you have those conversations?
Yeah, it's not an easy one. Although I will say I was blessed with a very numbers driven and pragmatic board and executive team. So that made it 1,000 times easier. There was not a ton of emotion. So the way I did it in this case is I just showed the numbers. Like, yeah, we can produce this pipeline, but it's not real pipeline. And our closed won rate has actually gone to the red zone. It was bad. It was not good. So we all agreed and we stacked hands on this isn't like the benchmark says this is not good. We need to improve our close one rate in order to create a repeatable motion. Then I started to go backwards and started to explore, okay, what was happening? And when you looked at the numbers, it was very clear that basically we were just punching everything through to pipeline. And any board knows that's not a healthy way to do it.
Right.
It was in some ways easy in that it was a very numbers driven conversation, but also try to align around our common incentives again. Like the board and my executive team and myself, we all want to grow this company in the most efficient way possible. We don't want to waste resources. So when you start to look at those numbers, it becomes very evident that we were wasting resources and just something was breaking down in that process. So that number really wasn't real. So we all kind of agreed in the end that the numbers we were looking at, you just couldn't compare. I actually ended up running a normalized model where I was like, okay, if the conversion rates actually held in the past, this is what the pipeline should have been. So we can actually compare to something as we look forward. And honestly, that's been the biggest challenge is I don't have a lot of year over year easy comparisons that I can make to say, okay, like we grew in the right way, but we're finally in the last quarter or so able to see some of those signs of very much improved conversion rates, improved year over year pipeline, and just a much more efficient model.
I love it. You know, when we make things simple, it's easy to communicate. It's
Yeah.
like if we our close one rates are here and they should be here, this is where our pipeline revenue, where we should have been in revenue. And all of a sudden, it's like clear pain point. Everybody agrees. And then you start just kind of peeling the onion back. So what I like about that is that you're illustrating the pain point, the challenge to the point where everybody nods their head. And as soon as everybody is in agreement, then you can move to the solution versus just trying to move directly into the solution. You bought in all your stakeholders.
Yeah, I think that's crucial. You have to take people through the journey that you went through to arrive at your solution. And what I've also learned is a lot of folks, maybe they don't understand marketing or how it works. So you have to take them through the entire journey to kind of lead them. And this is why I am proposing this plan. This is why this is the best way to spend our money and take these bets. And you got to be able to accept feedback. You know, you're not always going to be right, but at least you take them through the journey and hopefully everyone feels good about where we're going.
Yes, missed revenue opportunity should have been here and it's here. But by the way, if we have salespeople that aren't meeting their quotas and they're having a harder time because we're not supplying with the right leads, they're going to churn. And the a tremendous cost of hiring and retraining and getting up to speed. Any new salesperson can easily take 6, 8, 9 months to get up to full capacity and where they should be. So there's all kinds of anecdotal reasons why this is costing the organization dearly. So how significant, if we can kind of now transition, you've identified problems, you've understood your ICP, you've got a very, very customer focus. Tell us about the CMO's role in customer engagement and the significance of CMOs starting with these conversations, but you're kind of your POV on that and how you take customer engagement or customer experience and overlay it into what we've been talking about so far.
Yeah. And maybe it's because I come from that world and that's where I started my career that I just have a deep passion for and I'm not afraid to roll up my sleeves and do it myself. But that I think is the most important thing that you can do as a CMO. So again, the two or three things that I like to do consistently is direct customer conversations at every turn that I can. So I like to have these conversations, but then also turn them into something. They're not just conversations I have on the side. We share them internally whenever the customer allows us to. We also turn them into case studies and great content. Sometimes these conversations turn into webinars. So it actually ends up benefiting us in the end. So I think that's really, really important to just bring that back to the organization, not just let those conversations kind of die with you. The other thing that I think is really important is to not only have qualitative conversations, but to also back everything up with quantitative data. So I do like to always supplement a lot of my analysis and insights and any learnings back to the organization with data. I have developed a bit of a survey methodology that I do with customers every year that helps us benchmark certain points within the customer journey. And that helps us kind of observe our improvement in certain areas and focus in certain things for customers and actually make strides year over year. So I do try to make sure that we bring customer insights consistently back to the organization because they don't just benefit marketing, they benefit the entire organization from product to finance to engineering and sales, and et cetera.
Two things I love what you said there. One is you've got to translate what you're learning from having these conversations. Why are you having the conversations to learn if you aren't open to constantly learning and adapting and changing, right? And the second one is a customer benchmark survey. I love that. Tell me a little bit more about your benchmarking. And I think we all heard you say that and we're like, oh, I'd love to have one of those too. Tell me a little bit more about what you do in terms of your customer benchmarking.
Yeah, I'm actually finishing out this year's survey right now. I just finished analyzing it. So every year I like to, and this varies by organization, right? You adapt it to whatever your model is, but I like to use some pretty standard metrics to just measure ourselves against. And I also like to ask relevant questions to customers and get quantitative data each year or more frequently, just to be able to tell the organization how we're doing. So my methodology involves a very standard NPS survey that is also supplemented by product market fit measurements. And I'm actually able to take that. I'm always surprised by how many customers are actually willing to take the surveys, even though they're long. And then I'm able to segment it, analyze it so that we can start to get down into the details like, okay, which segments of customers are really happy with us and we're doing really well with versus where there are potential issues and where should we focus on? Is it worth focusing on those? And so forth. So I love to do that. It also sometimes gives me enough data to actually turn it into more thought leadership externally if you want to ask additional questions on the survey. But I also pair that with internal data. So I always like to look at segmenting my customers by whatever is important, trends of new customers we've been successful with in the past year, like how has it changed? Are we seeing new success in new segments? Where is our churn at? Which segments are churning the highest? And is there certain potential things we could be doing there? And so forth. So I like to look at the customer from a holistic point of view instead of just one metric at a time, because when you actually have a table and I put all the metrics together and I start to highlight them and I'm like, wow, okay, these segments clearly are really good for us. Maybe not so much, but just makes it a lot easier to make decisions across the board.
You are creating your own KPIs. I love that. That's going to be one of my biggest takeaways from this podcast right there. I've got one more question to ask of you. Based on everything that you've done in your career and what you're doing now and how you look at the market and your go-to-market motions, what are you the most proud of?
So for the last 4 or 5 roles that I've had, I've worked mostly for founding CEOs or CEOs that have been here since the very beginning of the organization. And what I really, really love is seeing them succeed, because you can tell when most people, when they start a business, it's just a grind. It's hard. Everyone probably tells you you're crazy and you're wasting your time. And it's just so satisfying to see their bet and their hard work actually pay off, and for me to help them get there. I'm so proud of that. I hope I continue to do this for the rest of the time. I love chatting with CEOs through my network. I get a lot of outreach from folks. They're like, hey, could you just jump on with the CEO and just chat them through marketing and just give them a piece of advice? And I'm like, sure, why not? Like, these people are putting their blood, sweat, and tears through this. And it takes a lot of guts to do it. And there's nothing more satisfying than seeing someone succeed and achieve their dream. So I guess that's what I'm most proud of.
Well, you're now going to have a link to this conversation that you could actually start sharing as well as a prelim to that conversation. So, Christina, thank you so much for coming on. I know we can go on for a long time here. So, if people did have additional questions, would it be appropriate if we handed out maybe a link to your LinkedIn profile that they could get a hold of you?
Absolutely.
All right. Well, thank you. I feel like I've kind of gone through a marketing MBA class in the last half hour here. So thank you for that. That's a very positive comment there. And we'd love to have you back on the podcast again soon.
Absolutely. Thank you. It was really enjoyable to speak here today.